They flee in crushing numbers, driven by war, by ethnic conflict, by natural disasters, by fear. Today, the number of the uprooted is staggering. 59.5 million forcibly displaced in 2014.
طبعا قتل كان بجنبي واحد كمان قتل براسه تمام انا اكلت 5 طلقات بالمنطقه هاي عد ما انصابت خلص شعرت انه خلص انتهت حياتي الالم كان ما يوصف.
The numbers explode upwards. 13.9 million newly displaced people. 11 million within their own country. That's the highest figure on record. In 2010, 10,900 people fled every day. 2013, that had tripled to 32,200. In 2014, it rose again, dramatically, to 42,500. A small city fleeing every day. In 2014, 1 person of every 122 in the world was forcibly displaced.
We no longer have the capacity to pick up the pieces. More and more people are suffering, and more of the people that are suffering have no chance to get protection or support because we no longer have the resources to do so.
Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia. Half the world's refugees are from these 3 countries. Conflict drives them out. Long, savage wars condemn them to bitter exile. Syria's neighbor, Turkey, became in 2014 the world's largest refugee-hosting country, with no fewer than 1.59 million people. It was followed by Pakistan, Lebanon, Iran, Ethiopia, and Jordan. Alongside the refugees, those forced from their homes, but not their countries. 2014 saw new conflict, new wounds, tens of thousands of the newly internally displaced. In Iraq, in Cameroon, Ukraine, Central African Republic, South Sudan. In 2014, they were 38.2 million, an increase of almost 5 million over 2013. Conflicts, new and old. But one brutal constant: the young bear the brunt of suffering. More than 50% of the world's refugees are under the age of 18. In northern Iraq, a small boy cries. He is Yazidi, driven with his family from his home. He is internally displaced. The system set up decades ago to help these people is at a tipping point. The world cannot turn away. We cannot simply do what we have done in the past. We must do more, much more, to overcome a crushing crisis.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Banshoff. I'm Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown. The powerful film we just saw is a fitting introduction for our presentation this afternoon. At this critical moment for the world community, we have the remarkable opportunity to hear from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, António Guterres, on the present and future challenges of global forced displacement. Now, in a moment, President DeJoyer will introduce the High Commissioner. First, I'd like to provide just a few words about the context for our gathering. We're now in the second semester of the Georgetown Global Futures Initiative, a university-wide effort to address questions of global scope with deep policy and ethical implications. Last semester, you may remember, our topic was the global future of development. This semester, it's governance, and we'll be turning to security next semester, and then to the environment. The initiative encompasses major events like this one, as well as research and teaching activities that draw on the strengths of our university as a whole, the expertise and passion of our faculty and students, our location and convening power here in Washington, D.C., and our Jesuit mission and identity as a university in service to the world. As we gather today, powerful images of war and refugees, so evident in the film and in our global media, have become a daily reminder of the extent of the forced displacement affecting the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and other parts of the world. It's really hard to imagine a more critical and complex contemporary challenge for global governance. So we are here today in search of deeper understanding of the origins and extent of the current crisis, but we also want to look forward with the help of the High Commissioner to explore how we can better grapple with future crises as a university and as a national and international community. So thank you all for being here this afternoon. It's now my pleasure to introduce our president, Dr. John J. DeGioia. Over the past 14 years under President DeGioia, Georgetown has developed and embodied the model of an engaged global university, a community whose academic mission, our commitment to excellence in research and teaching, is wedded to the pursuit of the global common good. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming President Jack DeGioia.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you for that very kind introduction and for your leadership as our university deepens our engagement around the world and on issues facing our global community. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to Georgetown and to Gaston Hall. We're grateful to have so many of you here and to have so many students with us who are part of our Refugee and Humanitarian Assistance Certificate Program and our Certificate in International Migration Studies, programs led by Dr. Susan Martin. Dr. Martin, who serves as the director of Georgetown's Institute for the Study of International Migration, will play a role later in our program when she engages our speaker in conversation. I'm also privileged to share that our Institute for the Study of International Migration will be partnering with UNHCR to co-edit next year's edition of the State of the World's Refugees, a global resource for policymakers, practitioners, and advocates working to address the kinds of governance issues that we will be discussing today. Dr. Martin will be editor-in-chief of this important publication. We're also honored to have with us faculty and staff who contribute to Jesuit Commons, Higher Education at the Margins, which provides higher education to refugees through an online platform, to students engaged in our Center for Applied Legal Studies at our Law Center, which represents refugees seeking asylum or humanitarian protection in the United States, and also our Immigration Law Journal, which publishes on issues related to forced migration, refugee law, and internal displacement. Throughout our history, Gaston Hall has served as one of the most important gathering spaces for public discourse in our nation's capital. And today, in this place that so often brings our community together in conversation and dialogue, we turn our focus to communities that have been forced apart by violence, hardship, conflict, to the unprecedented challenges facing displaced persons and refugees, and the governance questions posed by their plight. Already this fall, as part of our Global Futures Initiative, which, as Tom mentioned, focuses this semester on global governance, we've come together to hear from Dean Joel Hellman, the new dean of our School of Foreign Service, in conversation with our alumnus, Stefan Dujarric, who serves as spokesperson for the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. We also had the privilege to hear from Dr. Margaret Chan, Director General of the World Health Organization. In today's Global Futures Lecture, we're honored to welcome the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, António Guterres, to speak on a topic of serious urgency to our international community. How can we strengthen our global response to the challenges faced by refugees, from coordination between public and private institutions to the political will of nations to engage these issues? How can we build a better, more inclusive future for uprooted peoples? Over the course of his career, Mr. Guterres has served in governance positions on both national and international levels, serving as Prime Minister of Portugal, and as I said, now as UN High Commissioner for Refugees. In this role, which he has held for a decade, he oversees 9,000 staff working in 125 countries to protect a refugee population that has grown over the past 10 years from 38 million people to more than 60 million people. Through his work at UNHCR, he has championed the rights of displaced persons, sparked dialogue about the legal obligations of society to safely accommodate refugees seeking asylum, and worked to protect and support refugees through voluntary repatriation efforts, local integration, and resettlement programs around the world. Prior to his election as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in 2005, he spent more than 20 years in government and public service as the Portuguese Prime Minister from 1995 to 2002, and as president of Socialist International, a worldwide organization of social democratic political parties, which he served from 1999 until 2005. As president of the European Council in 2000, he led the adoption of the Lisbon Agenda, and he co-chaired the first European Union Africa Summit. We face today an urgent challenge with worldwide displacement at the highest level ever recorded since World War II. The current conflict in Syria alone has created more than 4 million refugees, half of whom are children. In the UNHCR report from earlier this year, the High Commissioner described this significant surge in displacement, saying, quote, "We are witnessing a paradigm change, an unchecked slide into an era in which the scale of global forced displacement, as well as the response required, is now clearly dwarfing anything seen before." Close quote. Pope Francis has echoed the seriousness of this challenge and the obligations we have to our global family. Last month, during his historic visit to the United States, the Holy Father addressed the refugee crisis in his address to the United States Congress, saying, quote, "We must not be taken aback by their numbers, but rather view them as persons, seeing their faces and listening to their stories, trying to respond as best we can to their situation, to respond in a way which is always humane, just, and fraternal." Close quote. This is the challenge we are facing today, with hundreds and thousands of refugees making their way to Europe, finding refuge in places throughout the Middle East, and the 125 nations where the UNHCR operates. And it's a challenge that we must respond to as a global community. I offer our deep gratitude to the High Commissioner for his leadership on behalf of displaced persons around the world, and for being with us today to engage with our community. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, António Guterres.
President Ijoia, dear friends, it's a great pleasure to be here in Georgetown. I was saying that Georgetown is probably the university in the world I've visited more times beyond my own one, but it's always a pleasure to be back. Globalization is asymmetric. Money moves freely. Many people believe that it even moves too freely. goods and services do not move entirely freely, but they move quite well. And we see global trade developing. But people face a lot of obstacles to move. And yet, as there is a financial market and there are markets for goods and services, there is increasingly a global labor market. President Ijoia said that I was a socialist, a moderate socialist, I would say. But one of the things I learned very quickly in my political activities was that markets exist and markets work. We can influence markets, we can regulate markets, but it's very dangerous to ignore markets and impossible to govern against markets. And it's very strange that some of those that are more in favor of the liberalization of the financial markets are exactly the same people that think that it is possible to completely avoid the work of a global labor market. And in all markets, offer and demand tend to meet, legally if possible, irregularly if necessary. And it also happens in the global labor market. And when people do not allow offer and demand to meet, smugglers will do the job. And it really breaks my heart to see people, namely Syrians or Afghans or Iraqis, that to move from Turkey to Greece have to put themselves in the hands of smugglers and risk their lives in the Mediterranean. I think it's totally unacceptable that a Syrian that wants to go from Egypt to Italy has to pay $5,000 to a smuggler and risk his or her life, when a tourist can move from Egypt to Italy in a low-cost carrier by about $50. Now, that is one of the dramas of today's world. And this asymmetric nature of globalization is also one of the key factors of inequality in the world. And I believe your last magazine number was about inequality. And one of the problems is that there has been an acceptance about the need for global governance of financial markets. There has been an acceptance for the need for global governance for the markets related to trade services and goods. But there has been a rejection in relation to any attempt to create a global governance system for migration. Migration has always been considered an intergovernmental issue and never a multilateral issue. There is a forum, but the forum is strictly intergovernmental. And there has been a radical opposition by majority of political leaders to any kind of international regulation of the migration phenomenon. And this is, I think, a very serious question that needs to be seriously addressed. I'm strongly in favor of making the International Organization for Migration join the UN. This is not always popular, but I think it would be important. And it would also be important to give the same organization some regulatory capacity that today is totally lacking. We have forms of regional cooperation in relation to migration, even areas of free movement of people, like the European Union. Again, there'll be some question marks at the present moment. But a multilateral approach to migration is, I think, one of the key questions of global governance that we are facing today. And the paradox is that exactly in a moment in which a lot of obstacles are put on the way people move, we have more and more people that are forced to move against their will. And indeed, we are witnessing a dramatic increase of forced displacement. There were some numbers that went very quickly in the film. I will remind you of them. In 2010, conflict was displacing 11,000 people per day. In 2011, 14,000. In 2012, 23,000. In 2013, 32,000. Last year, 42,500 people displaced per conflict per day. In 5 years, a multiplication by 4. And this shows that we are witnessing an equivalent multiplication in the number and in the intensity of conflicts around the world, where new conflicts emerge without being predictable or predicted, even if they might be predictable, and where old conflicts go on and on for decades without a solution. And so we have reached, as it is also well known since last year, a level of forced displacement by conflict unparalleled since the end of the Second World War. And I'm talking about forced displacement by conflict, which of course is very much in line with my own activities today. But there are other sources of forced displacement. Now, for those that are victims of persecution or conflict, and there are, some interpretations in relation to the 51 Convention that differ, and sometimes the same people are offered in some countries refugee status, in other subsidiary forms of protection, but it doesn't matter. There is a recognition that those fleeing a conflict are refugees or should be treated as such. There is a multilateral framework, there is international law, there is an institution like ours that is supposed to try to monitor, to make sure that things go in the right direction. But things start to be much less clear with people forced to flee for other reasons. And I'm not talking about traditional economic migration, but of the combination of a number of factors, where climate change is probably the determinant one, the most clear factor identifying the present times, and the greater accelerator of other contributions to forced displacement. But climate change, together with population growth, with chaotic urbanization in some parts of the world, with food, energy and water scarcity in other parts of the world, all this is getting more and more interlinked, enhancing the impacts of each of the factors, and forcing also more and more people to move, because life is no longer sustainable in several areas of the world. These are not entirely new phenomena. I don't like to use the expressions of refugee of the climate or refugees of the hunger, because climate change, a very important element of acceleration, doesn't imply that there were not storms in the past, there were not hunger in the past, there were not droughts in the past, deserts, these were being formed. But what we have now is an acceleration that is very clear, for instance, in an area like the Sahel. Some decades ago, there was a drought every 10 years, then every 5 years, now every 2 years, and probably in the near future, there will be a drought every year in the Sahel. And more people are forced to flee because life is becoming unsustainable in the areas where they live. And there is a gap in protection in relation to these forms of forced displacement when they cross borders. Within the borders of their own country, if governments are ready to do their job, they enjoy the protection of their own governments. We know it's not always the case, but if they cross borders, they are treated as if they were simple economic migrants, and beyond the general application of human rights law, they have no right to any form of adequate protection. There is an initiative recently developed by a number of countries, led by Switzerland and Norway, the so-called Nansen Initiative, that exactly tries to detect the protection gaps in relation to those forced to move because of climate change or the impacts of factors linked to climate change. But this initiative has led to some recommendations to a protection agenda that is, I would say, inevitably very timid to have the consensus of all the countries that were involved in this exercise. And again, doesn't establish a multilateral framework. And I was hoping that we could come close to something like the guiding principles of internal displacement that were approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations, but we didn't get even there. There will be, of course, some progress. There will be an intensification of international cooperation, of regional forms of cooperation, but we will still be lacking a global legal framework or a global mechanism of governance similar to the ones we have for refugee protection. This means that one of the key issues that especially when we discuss governance and we look at the future, one of the key issues that needs to be put on the table and that states tend to reject is the governance related to the movement of people, is the multilateral framework to address the problems of the movement of people. Ideally, we should be in a world in which people would move as freely as money. I'm not as naive as to think that this will be possible in the near future. But some of the steps I mentioned, to bring IOM into the UN, to give it some regulatory powers, some normative powers, to have more and more a multilateral approach to the discussion of migration and the work of the global labor market. At the same time, to move into filling the gaps of protection for people forced to move for areas not related to conflict are, in my opinion, steps that should be implemented and that are possible to implement. And I believe the political resistance will tend to be less and less strong if we mobilize the civil society, if we mobilize the academia, if we mobilize all those that think about these issues, that have no vested interest in keeping things as they are, and can have a strong role in making sure that political leaders around the world understand that people need to be better treated in the global governance mechanisms that we have. You might ask, why not then to change the 51 Convention and to adapt the 51 Convention to the needs corresponding to these new trends of forced displacement and new problems that we are facing. My word of caution is only one. I'm not sure in the human rights frameworks that exist and that were created after the Second World War, the Universal Declaration, the 51 Convention and others, I'm not sure that if they were drafted today, they would be as progressive as they were when drafted after the Second World War. So I'm not very enthusiastic about opening the discussion about the 51 Convention. I'm afraid we might end up with a lower level of protection for refugees than the one we have. In any case, in an university that has given very important contributions to the global discussion on migration and displacement, my challenge would be to join efforts with other areas of the civil society, of the academia, with even areas in government and in Congress that are interested in making things move, and to try to push in the direction that I believe is the right direction, to move towards a system of global governance, of multilateral nature, of the movement of people, of recognition of the global labor market, and of creating the conditions for migration to be respected and considered everywhere as part of the solution of today's world problems and not another problem of today's world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. High Commissioner. I've met almost all of your predecessors since, I think, Paul Hartling moving forward. And I must admit, in just observing your tenure at UNHCR, I think you speak so as eloquently and probably more eloquently and with more passion than I've seen in any of your predecessors. And I just hope that your successor is able to bring the same feelings and intellect to this job. But thank you so much for coming and speaking to us in the audience. I think much of the world attention right now is on the emergencies. The film describe them. Some of your remarks talked about the crises, the numbers of new refugees that are happening every year. But the majority of the world's refugees are actually, as you know, in protracted situations, and you've brought a lot of attention to that issue as well. So I think our audience would be interested in knowing more about that issue and what UNHCR is doing for the millions of refugees and internally displaced persons who've been in that situation now for decades.
Well, first of all, it is essential to bring that issue to the attention of the public opinion, of the governments, of parliaments all over the world. Because indeed, the attention of the public, obviously conditioned by the role of the media and the attention of the political leaders, has been very clearly on the emergencies, and I would say on especially some emergencies, the Syria probably with much more impact than Burundi, just to give an example, that is more far away and not perceived as a security threat by anybody. Syria thing became indeed such a mega crisis and so clearly linked to global security that people tend to be very focused on that. And it is important to make sure that those situations that are, as you mentioned, protracted, are kept in the international agenda and receive the attention and the support they need. Unfortunately, this is not happening. Unfortunately, we are having a very dramatic lack of resources when addressing, for instance, the old crisis in Africa. And we can only do it because we are able to use our unearmarked funding for those crises, because, just to give an example, the Central African Republic situation is funded for UNHCR at 20% of the level of the needs. This gives you an idea of what is the neglect of the international community in relation to those other situations that are not in the limelight. And if you allow me to be a little bit cynical, today it's very interesting. Refugees are in the center of the global public debate. No, but last year it was not the case. What has changed is not that the refugee problem became all of a sudden much more dramatic. What has changed is that refugees for the first time came in big numbers to the rich world, to Europe. And so, if you recall, for 2 or 3 months, all news around the world, in global media and in national media, would open with the European refugee crisis. The European refugee crisis is, of course, a serious crisis. We are talking about 700,000 people that came into Europe, but Europe, the European Union, has 550 million people. In Lebanon is 3 Lebanese for each refugee. But they came to the rich world. And because of that, there is a lot of attention. And because of that, the Syria refugee situation that is largely responsible for this is now getting much more attention again and much more funding. We received about $137 million for the Syria situation in 3 weeks after but zero for Central African Republic and zero for the other situations, Somalia situation and other protracted situations, or Afghanistan. And it is absolutely essential to make people understand that not because of generosity or solidarity, but strictly on a consideration of enlightened self-interest. All crises are becoming interlinked. From Nigeria to Mali, from Mali to Libya, from Libya to Somalia, but also to the Sinai or to Yemen, and then to Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. All these things are interlinked. Central African Republic becoming also part of it. Not only they are interlinked, but they represent a threat to global peace and security. And to think that we can address one crisis and forget about the others is completely stupid. So I think there are very good reasons to make the international community understand that it is absolutely essential not to let protracted situations in such a dramatic development that despair becomes widespread and that people will be ready to do anything to overcome the problem. I have to say that I am very happy to see the World Bank fully understanding this. And the World Bank will be soon contacting the key decision makers in relation to the international financial architecture in order to make sure that resources to address those areas, namely African areas, where we see some long-lasting situations having special development, because a protected situation becomes a development problem, not only a humanitarian problem, having adequate development financial instruments to address it, and also those countries that are middle-income countries, but that are, like Jordan, for instance, that are a first line of defense in relation to collective security, but also large refugee hosting countries, that those countries will also be able to benefit from instruments that today are totally absent, because as middle-income countries, they are not in the priority of development cooperation, and international financial organizations are not allowed them to give them any form of concessional funding. So, to make sure that we put the protracted crisis in the international agenda and to bring development actors into addressing the solution of those crises is, I believe, a must. It's not just a question of being nice to the poor people that are in such desperate circumstances. I think it's a must from the point of view of the global interests and also from the point of view of global collective security.
I certainly hope that you're right that this is going to move in that direction, because, as you know, the gap, this gulf between relief, humanitarian, and development aid has been a perennial problem in this area. So the World Bank has previously taken an interest in refugee, more in the context of repatriation. So what do you see as being basis for some optimism?
I think that there is a difference in relation to the traditional approach, which is to say, okay, we have humanitarian aid, and then we have a situation stabilized development cooperation. There is a gap between the two. We need to narrow that gap. And the present approach, which is to say development actors and humanitarian actors need to work together since the very beginning of a crisis in the same area and in the prevention dimension even before a crisis emerges. And this is what I believe for the first time international financial organizations are understanding. And that, if that is also understood by bilateral donors, linking much more clearly financial support to humanitarian aid and financial support for development cooperation, preserving the humanitarian space with its principles of impartiality, neutrality, independence, and humanity, but understanding the need to have development actors in those areas since the beginning of the crisis. If this is fully understood, and if the changes that I believe are necessary in the architecture of the forms of development cooperation and financial aid, I think that there will be a quantum leap in our capacity to address those forgotten situations.
Under your leadership, UNHCR has taken on some new responsibilities for internally displaced persons, and now is the lead of the cluster for the internally displaced. And yet we're seeing in so many countries that access to internally displaced persons is extremely difficult, if not impossible. And much of UNHCR's resources continue to be focused on refugees. Syria is a case in point where much more resources are for the refugees in neighboring countries than for the IDPs in Syria. Where do we need to go in terms of governance so that the internally displaced find some level of protection?
I think there are two levels of problems here. One is the fact that if you are internally displaced, you are under the authority of your own government. Your government is sometimes part of the problem, not part of the solution. And you are in the country where the conflict takes place. Most of the refugees manage to be, even if some are also in conflict situations, but they are not in the conflict they have fled from. And this represents a remarkable limitation in what the international community can do. We have witnessed in the recent past the national sovereignty agenda gaining ground in relation to the human rights agenda. I remember in the 90s, when I was in government, we had East Timor, we had Kosovo, we had Bosnia. At the time, we were talking about the right of humanitarian intervention. Later, the General Assembly of the United Nations has accepted the concept of the responsibility to protect. But the truth is that that has been a concept, but with very little consequences in practical terms. And national sovereignty is there again, with a paramount importance. And so the capacity of international organizations to protect and to assist people internally displaced is in many circumstances very limited. Look at Yemen today. I mean, sure. It's a very good example to show how difficult it is to do the job. On the other hand, the approach that was followed by the international humanitarian community and the United Nations for internal displacement is an approach based on the so-called cluster approach, in which you have a large number of entities, each one dealing with an aspect of the problem, with some coordinating some areas, and UNHCR has some coordinating responsibilities, but where the question of the provider of last resort is not clear. It is clear in refugee situations. If something is missing in a refugee situation, I feel UNHCR has a responsibility to fill the gap. And sometimes we are in big difficulties to do so. And sometimes we are not able to do so. For instance, we have established long ago an agreement with the World Food Programme in which we established that World Food Programme would be dealing with the questions of food in refugee settings. Because we no longer have the expertise, the capacity, the resources. And as you know, the World Food Programme has felt a lot of funding restrictions in the recent past, and because of that, there were problems in many refugee situations in relation to food support. Now, even if there is this memorandum of understanding, I always feel that our responsibility did not stop because of that. Right. And obviously we have not the capacity to, but we have the obligation to do everything possible to create the conditions for the World Food Programme to be able to deliver. If you look at internal displacement, these lines of accountability are much less clear. And there is not really a provider of last resort, but an advocate of last resort, which is a different thing. And the reality is that the level of efficiency of the international community when dealing with an architecture of lots of entities involved, without sometimes a very clear distribution of responsibilities, the efficiency is normally lower than the efficiencies that can be obtained when for one specific problem there is one entity that is clearly responsible for the solution of that problem. But these are complex aspects of architecture. At the time when this was discussed, I have suggested that instead of the cluster approach, we should have an approach of lead agency in each crisis, and agencies that could be different ones, depending on the capacity on the ground in each situation, leading the others. This was not accepted, and we moved into this more complex structural approach that exists today. Okay, we do our best to be part of it, but in my opinion, it is a system that has some gaps in relation to the accountability that should be required to make it more effective, even if that would never solve the problem, that the responsibility lies primarily with the state, and the state is sometimes part of the problem.
Right. In fact, Sadako Ogata, one of your predecessors, who was a graduate of Georgetown, received an honorary degree a couple of years ago, and she reiterated the statement that is often quoted about her, that there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems. There have to be political solutions. So do you see any changes in terms of the architecture that would allow some of these security issues and political issues to be better addressed?
No, I think that we live in a world in which there was never a global governance system, and much less a democratic one. And governance is, again, the issue that the semester is discussing. But both during the Cold War and during the 90s, when I was in government, and it was, I would say, the period of more clear American supremacy, power relations were clear. So as power relations were clear, even without a global governance system, there was a certain predictability in the way problems would emerge and problems might be solved. Now we moved into a period in which no longer, not only we remain without a global governance system, but power relations became unclear. And as power relations became unclear, we see, for instance, the total paralysis of the Security Council in relation to the key problems that we face. And we see around the world a sense of impunity and unpredictability in the way conflicts emerge. For me, the most obvious example of this is South Sudan. I mean, South Sudan, with a lot of support from the international community, and the United States was very strongly involved in it, emerged as an independent country 6 years ago now. Now, I mean, the whole international community was cherishing that baby, country. And there was a lot of commitment of support. And the truth is that 6 years afterwards, we see that essentially because of two leaders and their entourage, there are no political differences. There are no ideological differences. It's a matter of power and greed. They have condemned their country to the most appalling situation, the worst disaster from the humanitarian perspective. And the truth is that the international community until now has not found any way to really stop the situation. Now there is an agreement, finally the 5th or 6th agreement that was signed. Maybe it lasts, but it's not yet clear. The two signed the same paper, but with different interpretations. So we'll see what happens. I mean, this lack of capacity of the international community to prevent crises and to timely solve them is something that is having terrible consequences in the humanitarian dimension, and those numbers about the increase of new displacement are just the demonstration of it. How is this going to evolve? I mean, ideally, we should be moving into a world that will be more multipolar, but then with a strong multilateral governance mechanism or system. I always try to remind that we had in Europe, before the First World War, a multipolar system, but without a multilateral governance mechanism. And the result was the First World War. So multipolarity in itself doesn't solve the problem. I think it's positive to move towards a more multipolar world, but that without an effective multilateral governance mechanism, and we see it's very difficult for those that are now the protagonists of world affairs, we see it's very difficult for them to accept a truly multilateral governance system that would translate itself inevitably in some loss of sovereignty, namely of those that are the ones that lead the present dysfunctional system.
I'd like to press you a little bit more on one of the things in your talk, and that was the need for having a system that can respond to displacement from causes other than persecution and conflict. And you mentioned the Nansen Initiative. I was at the global consultation in Geneva where the Agenda for Protection was was issued. And I tend to agree with you that it is timid. I'm not sure anything more than that could have come out at this point. But where do you, whose institutional responsibility should people fleeing natural disasters, slow onset environmental change, climate change? We at the United States have been facing the entry of the children and families affected by gang and cartel violence. UNHCR has written very eloquently on that. So it seems that there are a lot of these gaps. So what kind of, I'm not sure that IOM coming into the UN is necessarily the solution for that, although I actually agree and have written on that subject. So where do we need to be building the institutional capacity to respond to these issues?
I mean, the easiest way would be if we would manage to have at least some guiding principles on this. That could be soft law, at least that. And if you'd manage to bring IOM into the UN system, I would be strongly in favor of a joint venture between UNHCR and IOM to coordinate the efforts of the agencies in relation to addressing this problem, with the need, of course, to have member states assuming their responsibilities, and they could do it through different forms. But the present situation is a situation of a gap. And I believe that it would be good to look into migration more broadly, not only into these aspects of displacement linked to climate change. I think we need to look into migration more broadly. And I sometimes perceive a tendency in the UN system to try to create another body within the UN to deal with it, or to use the other bodies in the UN to deal with it, or to parts of it. I think as IOM exists, the best would be to bring IOM into the UN family, and if possible, second step, more difficult, to have IOM with some normative capacity.
The last time I saw you before this was at the Global Forum on Migration and Development in Istanbul just a few weeks ago. Do you see a future in terms of that as a mechanism for moving towards the multilateral approach that you're discussing?
Well, there is a kind of original sin, because it was created exactly not to be multilateral. And in the beginning, when we tried a little bit from the outside to include in the agenda the human rights dimension, there was a big reaction. People wanted just to discuss, or some people wanted to discuss, only the economics of it. I mean, remittances, contribution to development, things of the sort, but enter into the rights of migrants was something a little bit awkward. Progressively, I think things have changed. And so I believe there is a potential there. And probably better than invent something else, it would be interesting to see if we can make that intergovernmental informal body move into probably a more formal mechanism, and later, if possible, integrated it into the multilateral system.
As you're thinking about your tenure at UNHCR, what would you define as your biggest accomplishment and the issue that you think will be the biggest challenge for the future?
About the biggest accomplishment, I have no idea. About the biggest challenge, I think clearly the biggest challenge today is the fact that with the present evolution of the global security situation, the difficulties of access linked to that, the evolving nature of conflict. Today, you no longer have a war between two states or a war between a government and a rebel group. You have in each scenario international forces, national forces, militias of different kinds, bandits, all kinds of actors, which of course complicate the Syria. Look at Syria. I mean, how many actors are there in the Syria conflict? In this scenario, the biggest challenge for us is the combination of facing growing needs and more people impacted, we have less proportionally, at least in 2016, even, in 2015, even in real terms, less resources and less access to many of the people in need because of the security constraints or the affirmation of national sovereignty that doesn't allow, I would say, witnesses to be present where some things are taking place.
What could the U.S. be doing? What could the United States be doing to be of more help to the UNHCR and to addressing these issues?
Well, I think there are many aspects. First, to lead an effort to have a much stronger commitment of the international community in support of humanitarian aid. Humanitarian budgets around the world probably today are 25 billion. I think Interaction knows better than us, but $25 billion. I mean, I don't know any mid-sized bank that was bailed out that costed less than that. I mean, indeed, the resources that are available for humanitarian aid are totally out of proportion, negatively in relation to the needs existing. Second, I think the UN should lead a fundamental review of development cooperation priorities and strategies in order to address the issues that I mentioned in a much more clear way, and lead the reform of a number of institutions linked to that, starting by the Bretton Woods institutions. And at the same time, I don't think the US can do what happened, for instance, in East Timor today. I mean, when we had the crisis in East Timor, the question was to convince President Clinton that an intervention was necessary. The moment President Clinton was convinced that an intervention was necessary, everything that seemed impossible the day before became necessary the next day. Indonesia accepted the intervention, Australia was able to lead it, the Security Council, which we were unable to convene for a meeting, immediately met and approved unanimously what had to be done, and things happened, and the massacre, the potential massacre, was avoided. I'm absolutely sure that today this will no longer be possible. And so the problem of leadership is more complex in an environment like today's environment, in which power relations are less clear. But when I see Secretary Kerry doing what he has been doing, namely in relation to the Syria situation now, I think it goes in the direction of what I believe the US should be doing. And that is in relation to each of the crises, as it is impossible to look into all of them at the same time, each of the crises to try to lead, to have the convening power to bring together those actors that are the key stakeholders of that crisis. I mean, in the Syria situation, this will never be solved in dialogue between the Syrian government and the Syrian opposition. It is very clear for me. You can have Geneva 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It will not change things if those countries that have leverage on the parties of the conflict, because they fund them, because they give them weapons, and basically looking at that specific situation, I would say the key countries are the US and Russia, that apparently are discussing more and more between the two, and that is a very good thing, but also Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey, and then we can argue whether or not Egypt or Qatar, but these five, I think, to have the convening power to bring them together and to make them understand that today they are losing much more than what they might win, that this became a threat to everybody and to those stakeholders in particular, and it would be much better to, put aside or at least limit the consideration of their different interests, and it is obvious the interests are different, and to understand that it is more important to put an end to this to this global threat and to this threat to those stakeholders. And of course, the stakeholders in the Afghanistan situation are probably different. It's China, Pakistan, India, together with the US, so it's a different, probably more difficult even to bring together. And I mean, in other parts of the world, it's with other stakeholders, but to lead those coalitions, I would say coalition of the willing, but coalitions of those that are the key to address the problems in the way that have the power to stop those that are fighting on the ground. I believe that this is the kind of leadership that makes sense today, and I believe that the US is clearly still the country in a better position to launch this kind of initiatives. Of course, it's much more difficult than when President Clinton could, just by deciding something, make sure that everybody would do the right thing immediately after.
I do want to open this up to questions from the audience. But then one last question from me. We're sitting in a university. We have a lot of our students.
I forgot resettlement.
Yes, I was sort of surprised, I must admit.
A bigger contribution to global resettlement programs.
Right. Yes. And we have a lot of students in the audience, including the students in our certificate program, who do want to work on behalf of refugees, either professionally or personally. What advice do you give them for those who are here, young, interested, willing?
Well, it's very different from person to person, but there is today one thing that is essential, and it is a battle of values. We are facing, on one hand, the need to express our deep beliefs in tolerance, in the fact that diversity in a society is an element of richness, not a threat. All society is becoming multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural. The need to express that very strongly and to fight all manifestations of xenophobia, of racism, of intolerance that are emerging in the world. And this is something that I believe the new generation has a capacity, because it's much more cosmopolitan than the old generations, and has lived diversity in a much stronger way. If you go to a European country, of course the US has always been a diverse society, but if you go to a European country, you see the older generations still very much concerned with the false identity problems, and you see the new generations much more open-minded and cosmopolitan. So to lead this battle of values is, I think, essential, and this is something that each person can do. Those that would like to get more involved, my suggestion is not to do it before ending the graduation. I once had a discussion with my daughter that on that, because she's a medical doctor, and at a certain moment she said, I want to interrupt and to go 1 year to Mozambique. That was the idea. And I said, what are you going to do in Mozambique? I volunteer. But, I mean, you are going to create problems to the organization in which you work. Why don't you finish your medical course, and after having some experience, you go there 1 year, work as a doctor, no? That would be helpful. But if you go just there to, I mean, be a volunteer of I don't know exactly what, you'll probably not be very helpful. So for those that would conclude there and put their expertise, admit the possibility during a period of 6 months or 1 year or whatever, to put their expertise at the service of a humanitarian cause in the US or outside, I think it is something that might be worth considering.
Very good. Lights are in my face, but please introduce yourselves and what program you're with, and we'll begin the Q&A.
Yes, hello. My name is Alejandro Lara. I'm from pursuing studies at the business school here at Georgetown. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting and illustrative. I would like to start, if I'm looking for a job, the first thing that will ask me, okay, give me your CV or your resume to find out what I know, my knowledge and skills and abilities. The question specifically is, with all due respect, if I go to your office and I ask you, well, at a push of a button, would you be able to tell me how many farmers are among of the refugees?
How many?
Farmers, how many electricians, how many engineers perhaps, how many plumbers? In other words, have your office conducted an assessment among refugees to know what they know? So therefore, they'll be better placed at a specific job or in a specific country. So that's pretty much the question I have for you.
The answer is very simple. That is, of course, taken into account in the registration, when the registration can be done. The problem is that in the majority of the countries where refugees are, and 86% are in the developing world, in the majority of those countries they are not allowed to work. And this is one of key aspects of advocacy that I believe would be very important, especially when one links development cooperation to refugee protection. And second, when they come to the developed world, many times their academic titles are not recognized. In my country, Portugal, we had a lot of problems to make a number of refugees that were medical doctors be allowed to exercise the profession. So yes, we have that data, but the difficulties one of the enormous vulnerabilities of refugees is exactly that one, is that in many situations in the world they are not allowed to work, or they have difficulties in seeing their skills recognized formally from the point of view of the exercise of a profession, which is more complicated in Europe than the United States, I believe.
Is that data shared across boundaries, or just specifically for you to use?
No, I mean, we don't share individual data with governments, because it's especially the governments of the country of origin, but when refugees are resettled, that, of course, is shared, or when refugees go back to their country, it is shared also, in order to allow for their qualifications to be as recognized as possible according to the legal system that exists in the country.
Thank you. Next, please.
Hi. I'm a graduate student and a fellow with the Global Futures program. And my question was concerning one of the main issues with countries accepting these migrant populations, while certainly not the only issue, is xenophobia and just a lack of understanding of these people. And education is pretty much the only way to truly combat this. How much of that burden should fall onto the UNHCR, in your opinion? And how much of that burden should be taken up by the nations that are having to accept these refugee populations? Thank you.
You mean the fight against xenophobia?
Yes.
I think that is a responsibility of all of us. That's a question of citizenship. If there is a contribution to global civilization that was given by Europe and the United States, because at the time this was also very clear when the United States was formed, that contribution is the values of enlightenment. It's not Christianity. Christianity is a contribution from the Middle East. No? For me, the most important contribution of Europe and this extension of European civilization at the time to global civilization were the values of enlightenment, tolerance, la primauté de la raison. I think this is something that should be in our DNA, and we should assume it as a collective responsibility. Of course, for UNHCR, it's vital, but it's for all of us.
Next, please.
Thank you very much again for sparing your time. My name's Tom Hoskins. I'm a master's student at the Law School in National Security and Human Rights. I note your comments about the responsibility of the press to keep the migration crisis in the press, and also the way that national governments' interest, or rich Western governments, I think you said, interests have been piqued because it's for the first time that those people are coming to their nations. My question relates to the publicized fear in the press of those rich Western nations of the migrant crisis being used by Islamic fundamentalist organizations to place fighters in foreign countries. And my question is twofold. Firstly, to what extent have you, working for the UN, witnessed such concerns amongst UN members? And secondly, to what extent should there be concerns amongst UN member nations?
Well, we take those things seriously. We have an anti-terrorism cell in our protection department, and we work with states and we exchange information on things. But let me be very clear. If you are a terrorist, I don't recommend you to try the refugee way to go to whatever country. First, if you try resettlement, you are going to be scrutinized, I mean, in the most terrible way. If you ask for asylum in any place, you will be immediately fingerprinted, whatever. You'll be interviewed. You'll be followed. Everybody knows where you are. When we sometimes discuss resettlement in the US today, and one of the arguments by some voices is to say, oh, if we have Syrians resettled, there is a risk of terrorists coming. Are you aware that if that reasoning is correct, 7,000 terrorists are entering Germany every day in the last 3 months, and I don't see yet any bomb exploding? No. Why? Because terrorists are not going that way. I presume they have the capacity and the instruments and the money to have either a passport or a good forged passport, and they will fly as fighters are flying. If you read what's happening in the foreign fighters coming into Syria, they fly to Istanbul, they fly probably business class, some of them, because of the money they make. They don't put themselves in the hands of smugglers, risking to die in the Mediterranean, to then go to a Greek island, from the Greek island to the continent, from there to Macedonia, from Macedonia to Serbia, from Serbia to Croatia, from Croatia to Slovenia, from Slovenia to Austria, from Austria to Germany. I mean, being registered all the way on. They are not stupid. I can guarantee that they know very well what they are doing. And indeed, my belief is that even if we are attentive, even if we are in favor of all the measures of intelligence and scrutiny to be in place, I believe that the risk of terrorist organizations using the refugee protection mechanisms is relatively minor compared with other risks that are very clear in societies.
Thank you. Next, please.
Hello, sir. Thank you again for your time today. My name's Brittany, and I'm a freshman in the School of Foreign Service here. But a group of us here are representing the organization One World Youth Project, which is involved in global education for youth. So students in America are involved with students overseas, working on how to become better global citizens. And now in the video, it said that a large portion of the displaced people are youth. So we were youth, children. So we were wondering how education plays into this discussion, what is being done about education, what isn't being done, and how we can get involved to help out with this issue.
It is one of the most dramatic gaps in humanitarian aid and in development cooperation linked to the humanitarian aid. Only 2% of the earmarked humanitarian aid goes to education. This gives you an idea. And if you look at the refugee population, 1 in 2 have no access to primary education. 3 in 4 have no access to secondary education, and 99 per 100 have no access to tertiary education, to university. This shows how dramatic the gap is in relation to education, and how this should be a priority of the international community.
Next, please.
Hi, Commissioner. My name is Sahil Nair. I'm a freshman in the School of Foreign Service, and I'm here with other members of my pro seminar. It's titled Borders, and we focus on immigration and migration across borders. That's why we've come to hear you speak, and thank you again for giving these remarks. We're researching the International Convention on the Protection of Human Rights for Migrant Workers and Members of their Families, proposed in the 90s, ratified in 2003, and only 46 countries have currently ratified that convention as of now, and all of those countries have been countries where refugees originate from rather than countries where refugees are traveling to. Do you have any, could we hear your analysis on that convention and maybe some reasoning as to why countries that are receiving those refugees haven't ratified it rather than simply the origin countries?
Well, it's very simple. Rich countries do not ratify the conventions. And the reason is they don't want a multilateral instrument to rule migration. If you talk with experts of migration services, they will give you fantastic arguments explaining why those conventions are not perfect, or they shouldn't be ratified, or they have flaws, or whatever. But the real reason has been the resistance against multilateral governance mechanisms of migration.
Is there any way that we can address that problem to
it's a
bring
political
rich countries
problem,
to the table?
And that needs to be solved politically.
Thank you.
Hi, Rabin Pasha. I'm an Iraqi Kurdish former refugee myself, came to the US in '96, worked for many years with the US government, UN in Iraq as well, and now I founded an organization that focuses on entrepreneurship cultivation in Iraq as a way to engage people and build stability. So I just got back from Iraqi Kurdistan, which, as you know, has about 2 million internally displaced people from the rest of Iraq and refugees there, majority of them young people, and with tremendous economic despair and lack of engagement in the economy. And I bring that up because some of that is a cause of the instability, and it's also a cycle that leads back into further instability, violence, extremism, breaking the contract with the state, you name it, and further migrations. And I would love to hear your thoughts about what you're doing and what you can do as UNHCR also in Iraq, and two aspects of partnerships. One of them working more with the local CSOs and also UNDP, which is the development agency, working mostly with IDPs and the local government to prevent these internally displaced people of becoming refugees. And also, what about the business solution? And I would almost add that to what the former High Commissioner had said about we need business solutions. What can be done in partnering with the private sector to create economic opportunities that will build the foundations of preventing the fragility that's currently happening, that leads to more IDPs who could then become more of a problem of refugees and migrants outside? Thank you.
I think it's, in relation to the last part of the question, it is clear that wherever it is possible, and Iraq is not probably the best country to test it, but wherever it is possible, the fact that you engage the private sector and you engage the entrepreneurial capacity of the refugees themselves. For instance, Somalis. You can't imagine. Somali refugees, wherever they go, they immediately start businesses. I mean, they have an enormous capacity. And in Somalia, they have proven it. Somalia is fighting, but they immediately start doing things. Lebanon is another country. In the end of the civil war, the civil war ends in the morning. In the afternoon, they are already rebuilding everything. So, indeed, I mean, whatever we can do to support and to stimulate this entrepreneurial capacity is essential. Now, the situation in Iraq is complicated, as you know. First, the security situation in the IDP generating areas. I'm not talking about southern Iraq, that it's a different story, but in Anbar or Mosul area or Suleimania, these provinces, those that have generated displacement, the situation is absolutely tragic. And the capacity of the international community to operate is very limited because of security reasons. And at the same time, the Iraqi government now has seen its resources dramatically diminish because of the low oil prices plus the war effort against the Daesh. So Iraq is indeed an extremely problematic area to allow people to have a normal life in displacement. what we are also doing, because there is a large number of Iraqis that recently fled essentially to Turkey, has been to negotiate with the Turkish government the possibility of Iraqis to work. And this has been a rather complex negotiation because Turkey doesn't recognize refugees except the European refugees. And this is one of the things that come from the dysfunctionality of the relationship between the European Union and Turkey. But I mean, it's a long story. It was possible to negotiate for the Syrians a regime of temporary protection that was going to allow them to work now, but unfortunately the political crisis came before the regulation of these. With Iraqis, after complex negotiations, they didn't want to give the temporary protection regime, but after a certain amount of time, the Iraqis were allowed to choose either the temporary protection regime or the individual asylum requests presented to UNHCR for the moment. That gives them the right to work. So, I mean, and we have been trying to negotiate these in order to allow for Iraqis, to the extent possible, to be self-reliant in Turkey. But we are seeing more and more Iraqis also moving into Europe, as you know. And that is probably difficult to stop. There is some economic activity in Kurdistan, and a lot of, that part is booming, but the number of IDPs and refugees in Kurdistan is absolutely gigantic. So again, the capacity to address the problem is quite limited. So I'm entirely in agreement with everything you said. You just picked the wrong country to make it easy to apply the doctrine.
Thank you.
Very, very few times I would disagree with you, High Commissioner, but in this case I would, because I think there is tremendous, and I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards, so not to take up so much time, but there is tremendous private sector possibility and initiative between host community and IDPs to actually work together and create that entrepreneurship.
Excellent.
Thank you. Next.
Hello, my name is Musaddiq Habrara. I'm an AFL student. I just moved from Libya, where I used to be IDP myself. Also, I'm a founder of Vision Center for Peace and Mediation, where we're working to support the Libyan peace-building process, including the refugees and IDPs issues. Libya represents a place where actually it represents different aspects of refugees matters, where Libya represents a place where ongoing conflict going on, where you can find national IDPs and refugees. Also, it represents a bridge for most of the regional refugees countries, such as from Central Africa, Mali, Somalia, also from Syria, refugees using Libya to cross the Mediterranean for new life. However, recently we heard...
Your question, please.
Yes, my question is, recently we learned that some AU members are thinking or considering military actions to stop this human trafficking / refugee mobility on Mediterranean. For you as a head of the UNHCR, what's your perspectives and comments on response for such claims from some EU members?
It's not a claim from some EU members. It's a decision of the EU that was ratified by the Security Council. And that is to allow EU Navy ships to intercept smuggling activities in the high seas, not in Libyan waters, and with the condition, of course, that those victims should be not attacked, and on the contrary, should be received and disembarked in European soil, but allowing to arrest the smugglers and to destroy their equipment, etc. So this is what was decided, and our position has been to be vigilant, to make sure that the refugees themselves, or the migrants themselves, do not become victims of this operation.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for just one very brief question, and then we'll bring this to a close.
Thank you. My name is Georgetown, and I am with the Woodrow Wilson Center. a think tank here in Washington. As a former refugee myself from South Sudan, these issues of refugee touch my heart. I want to ask you a very important question, which is, what explains the evolving nature of conflict since World War II? I mean, the refugees flee the country because of some push factors. And we have seen how the number of refugees or the displaced people has grown so fast in World War II. So what explains the evolving nature? And second to that is either a lack of political will on the side of international community to address the push factors. Because if the argument is resources are limited to address the push factors, we are still utilizing those resources even after the fact, such as the emergencies now in Europe. So why don't the international community take a proactive approach to address the crisis before they get worse? Thank you.
Well, the cynical response to your question is because prevention doesn't make headlines in any news. Nobody knows about prevention, nobody gives credit to those that avoided conflicts, and the only thing that draws the attention is the conflict in itself and then the response to the conflict. So this is the cynical question, the cynical answer. I mean, trying to be a little bit less cynical, it is important to recognize that sometimes prevention is difficult. I mean, even if, to be honest, I feel that in many circumstances, there is a state of denial. People hope that nothing will happen until the very last moment and try not to do anything, and then it's too late. But what explains conflicts to change? I think the fact that conflicts today are much more chaotic in the nature of the actors involved is also one of the consequences of this lack of clarity in power relations in the world. I mean, you have much more actors and it's much more difficult to put some discipline in the way they act in the different conflict scenarios that we face.
Well, I'm sorry, this will have to be the last question. And please join me in thanking the High Commissioner for his comments. Thank you so much.